Okay, so now beginning with the diagnosis and primary of management of primary autoimmune hemolytic anemia, we'll be just going through. Basically, the objective is that the management of patients with autoimmune hemolytic anemia needs to be is individualized in all patients, and the guidance may not be appropriate to every patient, but in all cases, individual patient circumstances may dictate an alternative attempt. So, regarding autoimmune hemolytic anemia, it is actually a decompensated. It is a decompensated acquired hemolysis. Basically, it's the since it's autoimmune, so it's a host immune system acting against its own red cells. So this is one difference. Immune hemolysis may be autoimmune, alloimmune, or drug induced. We are going to be concerned with the autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and in this case, it's a decompensated, and mostly it's an acquired hemolysis. But we'll be going into details about all the causes of whether primary idiopathic causes or whether they are secondary causes. Now it can occur at any age, and incidence generally rises with age. And serologically, then they are divided into these warm type and the cold type, that is further divided into the cold hemagglutinin disease and paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria or PCH. And then there's the mixed type. So we have warm, cold, and then the mixed. Most of them, that's about 65% of them, are the warm type, and the cold type can be divided into basically most of the chunk of the cold type is the cold hemagglutinin disease, which is known as CHAD, which is also known as CHAD. This is about 29%, and the rest 1% of it is only the paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. Um, so we have like 65 for warm and a total of 30% for cold autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and the mixed have the other 9 of the other 5%. So approximately half of them are, and of all these cold, warm, and mixed autoimmune hemolytic anemias, all of them have a primary and it is an idiopathic or a secondary causes. And patients with autoimmune hemolytic anemia, now regarding the symptoms, when we assess the clinical features, they will be mostly in the form of anemia, features of anemia, and features of hemolysis. So because it's autoimmune hemolytic anemia, so there will be anemia and hemolysis. And then the autoimmune nature will be, of course, dealt with on further lab investigations. So they will, but clinically there will be just features of anemia and hemolysis. Anemia can present as weakness, dizziness, and dyspnea, and hemolysis as jaundice and dark urine. And symptoms of an underlying disorder may also be there. Without an underlying disease, examination may be unremarkable or reveal mild pallor or splenomegaly. Less often, severe hemolysis leads to hepatosplenomegaly. So they could be in not only anemia and jaundice, but or there could be symptoms of the underlying disease. But if there are no underlying disease, then this anemia, then this hemolysis may be so severe as to cause not only just the jaundice and dark urine, but it can also cause the hepatosplenomegaly and hemoglobinuria. So the dark urine can would initially be something like just could actually be we would need to differentiate this between hematuria and hemoglobinuria, and in the end, even signs of heart failure can be present. So if severe hemolysis sets in, then even hepatosplenomegaly, hemoglobinuria, and signs of heart failure can set in. Now we'll be going through all the different types of the autoimmune hemolytic anemia, such as the cold hemagglutinin disease, and then there's also the paroxysmal cold. So of these, mostly if we can go into the clinical features, generally all have the same features of anemia and hemolysis. And depending on the severity of hemolysis, it can be just like jaundice or urine or dark urine, or then can either also when the hemolysis is very severe and extravascular hemolysis is also occurring in intravascular as well. So hepatosplenomegaly and hemoglobinuria can occur in those causes, in those circumstances, with extravascular being hepatosplenomegaly and with intravascular we have hemoglobinuria. And then with cold hemagglutinin disease, with this type of disease, it's mostly in the elderly, in the middle-aged people, and it's idiopathic in nature. And it would be it occurs mostly as a chronic clonal disorder. And the symptoms here are mostly these cold-induced acrocyanosis. So acrocyanosis is the dusky blue appearance of toes, fingers, nose, tip, or ears. Or it could be Raynaud's phenomena, which can occur in 40 to 90% of patients. So this Raynaud's phenomena is also that triphasic color that can be acquired by the skin. It is the color change from white, blue, red. And it's various causes. Uh, Basically, in primary Raynaud's disease, it's just the Raynaud's phenomena which is there, in which the white color of the skin is due to the occlusion of blood vessels, loss of blood flow to the area, and then the blue color coloration is because of consumption of oxygen consumption in that area. And then subsequently, the blood flow is restored, and this causes the reddish color to be apparent in that area. So the change of color from white to blue to red is the Raynaud's phenomenon. So this acrocyanosis would be the dusky blue appearance. So it could either be a sort of intermittent sort of an appearance like in Raynaud's, or it could be a persistent sort of a dusky blue appearance of the toes, fingers, and nose of tip and ears. So it can vary from patient to patient. Either it could be a phenomenal sort of a change of color, triphasic change of color, or it can be a permanent sort of a dusky blue appearance of the fingertips or nose and hair. Then you have secondary CHAD. So this is the primary CHAD, which occurs mostly in elderly, and it's idiopathic. And mostly there's an underlying disorder associated, and it occurs in patients aged more than 40 years of age. And the secondary CHAD, this can be self-limiting. Now, this is the primary CHAD occurs in elderly and is more chronic, and it's basically associated with an underlying disorder. So, and in case of secondary chronic cold hemagglutinin disease, this is usually self-limiting and occurs in following childhood infection, and this usually occurs in children. So, and this can usually occur after some sort of a viral illness with those children as well. And this is then termed as cold agglutinin syndrome also. The primary one is the cold hemagglutinin, cold hemagglutinin disease, that is CHAD. And the secondary one is also known as the cold agglutinin syndrome. And then the paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, this is the one that is typically, this also occurs in children. It presents after 1 to 2 weeks after an upper respiratory tract infection or other childhood disorders, illness with acute fever, abdominal pain, back or leg pain, and hemoglobinuria. And hemolysis can be severe and intravascular, but usually settles over several weeks. So in this case, we will actually be going through much of the paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria at the end of when we have discussed all the. I think it's basically at the end of the guidelines as well. It's dealt with separately, so I think we'll be going into much of the management at the end in the special cases of this primary autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So first we'll be going through the primary hemolytic anemias associated with and the primary autoimmune hemolytic anemias, their diagnosis and treatment. And then there's a section on paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria at the end, in which they have mentioned the various causes and the various infections that can lead to paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, and the laboratory features, because its diagnosis is just somewhat different. So now regarding the diagnostic approach to suspected autoimmune hemolytic anemia, when a patient presents with suspected autoimmune hemolytic anemia, 3 questions should be considered. That is there hemolysis? Is the hemolysis autoimmune? And what is the type of autoimmune hemolytic anemia? So basically, first we need to document hemolysis, then whether whether the hemolysis, as I told you, it could be autoimmune, alloimmune, or drug-induced. So we need to determine whether the hemolysis is autoimmune, and then what is the type of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Then if it's autoimmune, then whether it's cold, warm, or mixed. So if there is in considering the questions for hemolysis, you need to be particular about the typical laboratory findings in patients with hemolysis. That is bilirubin, whether it's unconjugated, if unconjugated bilirubin is increased, or reticulocyte count is increased. So the features of hemolysis would be the unconjugated bilirubin increased, and reticulocyte count increased, and LDH may be normal to increased, and haptoglobin is reduced. So the blood film would also show spherocytes, agglutination, or polychromasia. And urinary dipstick test positive for blood, but urine microscopy is negative for red cells. If hemolysis is intravascular, leading to hemoglobinuria, then so the blood film would show agglutination and the signs of spherocytes or polychromasia, and even the urinary dipstick would be positive for blood, but urine microscopy would be negative. So this is they're trying to actually differentiate between hematuria and hemoglobinuria. So in case of hematuria, there would be there would be red cells on red cells would be positive on basically on microscopy. And in fact, there's even a test for hematuria, that is when you send when you have a blood like reddish bloody urine, you can centrifuge it for it to for us to differentiate between hematuria and hemoglobinuria. If the centrifuge, the red cells settle down in case of hematuria, but in case of hemoglobinuria, the color would remain reddish in color. So this is also comes out of clinical test. But then there is also a differentiation between if the color remains reddish of the urine, then we can even differentiate. We have to not only, it's not just going to be hemoglobinuria, it could also be that the cause could also be traumatic trauma to the muscle. So it could be rhabdo or rhabdomyolysis. So even that can cause a reddish color. So we need to have a history of whether there's been a trauma to the any sort of history of trauma or muscle trauma. So we need to just differentiate between rhabdomyolysis and hemoglobinuria. So, but urinary DIPS test will be positive for blood, but urine is microscopically negative. This would differentiate hematuria and hemoglobinuria. And then urinary hemosiderin can also be detected approximately 1 week after onset of intravascular hemolysis. So even after 1 week of intravascular hemolysis, the urinary hemosiderin can be detected. However, of course, there may be confounding factors, as these laboratory tests are not highly specific, and some parameters may be normal, especially with the mild compensated hemolysis. So mostly we have in the beginning we had talked about autoimmune hemolysis as being a decompensated acquired hemolysis. So in this case, if the hemolysis is compensated, then most of the lab parameters will also not be there, and most of the clinical findings will also not be there. It's only the decompensated part that would present clinically, as well as parameters would also be out of range. So the differential diagnosis, basically this table of in the table 1, basically they have gone through all the causes of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Actually, if we go from table 2, because this is the one where we were discussing that if we document hemolysis, then we need to know whether this hemolysis is autoimmune or alloimmune, or whether it's drug induced. But if there is hemolytic anemia, then we also need to take not only the autoimmune and alloimmune and drug induced causes in the immune component, but we also need to rule out hereditary causes of hemolysis and anemia, that they could be in membranopathy, enzymopathy, or hemoglobinopathies. And then in the non-immune component, there could be there's a wide range of problems that could be associated with hemolysis. So there could be renal disease and DIC, oxidant stress. So there are a large amount of non-immune causes which could include in not only chemical like oxidant and chemicals and mechanical stresses, or but also physical stresses like that one of uh, as in long distance run workers, and also along the capillaries if there is any sort of thrombosis with TTP and HUS. So and also with paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria in severe burns, and also in corporeal circuits. So it could be like both chemical as well as mechanical and physical even stress, and even infections can cause it, like in with malaria and Clostridium perfringens. So hemolysis is basically a broad term. It could be it could be hereditary and acquired, and in case of hereditary we have the membranopathies, enzymopathies, and the hemoglobinopathies. um, and in acquired there is all the immune and the non-immune causes. So we need to rule them out in history. So in first we need to document the hemolysis, and then we need to find out whether the hemolysis is autoimmune or not. Then once we've documented the autoimmune nature of hemolysis, we need to find rule out the causes for warm, cold, or mixed type of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And in this state, because warm and cold both have primary and secondary causes, so they have mentioned all of them here, that mostly the secondary causes of worm are autoimmune hemolytic anemias are the neoplasms, the infections, then immune dysregulations, and also in immune deficiency syndromes. So in all those cases of infections with hepatitis C, HIV, CMV, and varicella, also in pneumococcal infections and leishmania and tuberculosis, and in sort of autoimmune disorders like the SLE, Sjogren's, and scleroderma, and ulcerative colitis and sarcoidosis, and also in immune deficiency syndromes like uh, combined immune deficiency. And then in cold autoimmune hemolytic anemia, when we have so there could be a lot of infections in autoimmune infection, immune dysregulation, and immune deficiency syndrome. La- So even in this common variable immune deficiency, so we have both the B and T cells affected. So and also post transplantation, this can all occur in warm secondary type of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. In cold autoimmune hemolytic anemia, it's mostly the cold hemagglutinin disease, and here this is and the paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. So in the secondary causes for cold hemagglutinin disease, we since this is mostly going to be the IgM type, so we have all those malignancies and mycoplasma infection and mononucleosis, and also in malignancies you can also have macroglobulinemia. So all those M's, they come together here: malignancies, CLL, NHL, and even Waldenström macroglobulinemia. In fact, infections with mycoplasma and infectious mononucleosis. And then autoimmune are also autoimmune disorders here as well. Just like they cause immune dysregulation here, they can also cause cold type of autoimmune anemias. And post transplantation here as well, and also post allogenic hematopoietic stem cell transplant. And the paroxysmal cold hemoglobinurias, I had mentioned that there's actually a list of infections that can trigger this sort of an hemoglobinuria in infants, and these can be mostly the mycoplasma and measles, mumps, and usually varicella. So mostly after infections with this infectious mononucleosis and mycoplasma, both of them can cause infections, and in adults even syphilis can trigger this cold paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. So these are the causes, but after we have delved into whether the hemolysis is there, then if is it immune or not. So this is the differential that a direct antiglobulin test will actually detect most of the immune component. Of course, there's that part where the that will may also not be negative, may be negative, and I think they will subsequently dwell on that as well, because the DAT would detect the type of, IgG, M, and A, or the complement, mostly the C3d, which is the terminal part of the component which is activated by the IgM. So IgM can activate it mostly up till the C3d, which is bound to the red blood cell membrane. Beyond that, immunoglobulin IgG can cause activation up till the MAC complex. So in the presence of hemolysis, which is this suggests an immune etiology. But so whenever there is this presence of hemolysis, both clinically in the patient, whether he may be jaundiced or if he has hemoglobinuria or history of dark colored urine. So in that case, even clinically, and then as also when there is lab findings consistent with uh, uh, increased bili or increased reticulocyte count and increased LDH and reduced heptoglobin levels, then the blood film would also suggest this sort of in case of agglutinations, they are mostly seen in type in the cold hemagglutinin diseases, and there could also be spherocytes and polychromasia, with the polychromasia of course associated with increased reticulocyte count. So all these features, if they are there with the blood test and the urine in both the blood and the urine exam, so they would suggest an immune etiology. And however, a clinical assessment is required before a diagnosis of autoimmune hemolytic anemia can be made. And for this, we will perform, of course, the DAT. When we clinically suspect immune hemolytic anemia, we'll perform the direct antiglobulin test. And this is mostly first going to be in the done with polyspecific, but it typically monospecific IgG and anti-C3d antibodies are used in the initial screening, and this helps to determine the type of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Now, a positive, they have mentioned here as well that the positive DAT is not specific and is also associated with a wide range of non-hemolytical diseases. And these would include all those liver disease and kidney disease and liver disease as well. So it's like liver disease also and renal disease also. And it could be after infections, chronic infections, and malignant and these immune disorders, autoimmune disorders. So and also after IVIG administration, and also after anti-thymocyte globulin. So these are all these conditions: liver disease, chronic infection, so infection, autoimmune, and even malignancy. So even malignancy can trigger this. So the DAT even can be positive in renal disease, liver disease, infection, autoimmune, and malignancy, and after IVIG and anti-thymocyte globulin administration. So in all these causes, there could be a non-immune hemolysis. So that would be, so that although positive is, even if it is positive, there could be a lot of false positive results with that as well. And also, I think they go into detail later on that there could be also causes that could give false negative results. And these false negative results could be due to low affinity antibodies. So that would actually detect all those RBC bound antibodies. So those antibodies could be like false positive because of passively bound antibodies that could be there in as in the case of other diseases like in infections, inflammations, and autoimmune diseases, and also with as we discussed with drug administration, particularly the IVIG and the intravenous immunoglobulins and anti-thymocyte globulin. And also in diseases with liver diseases and renal failure, there could be like non-specific substances that can bind to the red blood cell and mimic sort of a positive DAT. So they could give false positive DATs. And there could also be cases where the antibody level is low. So it could be low affinity antibodies and low levels of red cell bound antibodies. Either the antibodies have low affinity or the red blood cells actually have low bound levels of antibodies. So either the titer could be low or the affinity of those antibodies could be low, or either the type of test that we are using could not be suitable for the anti-immunoglobulin testing, because mostly we use this conventional tube method to detect test, and this is more prone to error. So whenever a DAT comes out to be negative, there is also we can also proceed. The next thing is of course, it would be a DAT negative autoimmune hemolytic anemia, but most of these cases can be picked up if we do more sensitive tests, like the gel column agglutination test. Even from gel, we can even and this is done using red cell elution technique. So in the red cell elution, you could actually elute the antibodies, or the antibody coated RBCs are treated with buffer that causes the dissociation of antibodies from the RBC surface, and then this concentrated eluate is then reacted against this supernatant, this concentrated, which has those concentrated RBC eluates. This is then reacted against the reagent panel cells to determine the specificity of whether it's an auto or allo antibody. So even you could do red cell elution techniques and or gel column agglutination, or even that solid phase assays, and even red cell elution techniques, and there are a wide range of techniques that can be done. Even a direct polymerase testing, like certain using certain reagents to increase the agglutination, or even flow cytometry in the end can be used to detect all those cases of that negative autoimmune hemolytic anemias. So the DAT is, however, recommended, and just to increase the specificity of the DAT, we should use monospecific anti-IgG and anti-C3d components. So they have, at a minimum, the DAT should be include monospecific, and because this would then, of course, monospecific for IgG would suggest warm, and for C3d would, in a way, suggest a cold autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So before diagnosing before I now first we documented the hemolysis, that was on blood chemistry and on blood film as well, and then in urine also, in urine microscopy, and also in urine by doing urinary hemosiderin. Then we documented the immune nature, that it's immune in nature uh, by proceeding with the direct antiglobulin test, and then to before diagnosing it to be autoimmune, we need to rule out alloimmune. So just to rule out the alloimmune causes and the drug associated causes, we could take a detailed history of any blood transfusion which could have led to sort of a delayed hemolytic transfusion reaction, or has the patient received or any transplant, or solid organ or allogenic stem cell transplant. Then also which could lead to alloimmune hemolysis is in transplant, which may be ABO induced or a passenger lymphocyte syndrome. So in all these cases, whether it's a transplant or whether it's a transfusion or a transplant. In case of transfusion, we will consider the delayed hemolytic. In case of transplant, we'll consider the ABO mismatch, a major ABO mismatch, or passenger lymphocyte syndrome. And then in case of infants, even the hemolytic disease of the fetus and newborn could be done. Then in case of, we could also take drug history, because there are certain drugs which are associated with the hemolytic hemolysis. So, and also other causes of hemolysis, that is, given the high prevalence of an incidental positive DAT within the hospital population, consider whether there is an alternative cause of hemolysis or abnormal laboratory values. So, so basically, first we documented the immune nature, the hemolysis, and then the immune nature of the hemolysis um, by documenting the DAT, and then we have to document we have to rule out all the causes of other causes other than autoimmune, that is alloimmune and drug induced, or those all should be ruled out. And then they mentioned this DAT negative autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So for DAT negative autoimmune hemolytic anemia in patients with the unexplained hemolysis and a negative screening, that we can retest with the column and using monospecific anti-DG and anti-IgG and anti-C3d. So, and if possible also red cell eluate testing. So up till here, when we have ruled out all the other causes of hemolysis, we are left with autoimmune hemolysis. So now we're going to proceed with the panel for autoimmune investigations for autoimmune hemolysis, whether in what cases it will be warm and cold and vice and for mixed. So I think probably they just a reminder for all of you. There's like break in between because of the 40-minute session. We will rejoin again, and then we will continue with this warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia and the cold CHAD and PCH. Of course, they will dwell within the end. And then also regarding this investigations in patients presenting with autoimmune hemolytic anemia, their primary evaluation and then the additional tests that are done to document this immune hemolysis. Basically, if we go through this, the primary evaluation would basically be the history, then this is the hemolysis screen. So it includes all the blood investigations for haptoglobin, bilirubin, DAT, and reticulocyte count, and then the urine investigations for hemosiderin and microscopy. Then there is a detection of underlying disease for investigation of autoimmune hemolytic anemias. So this would include all the viral serology, the autoimmune profile, and all the tests for in the infections, different types of infections. And the immunoglobulin levels, even they can be done. So the Ig levels, the viral serology, and then the autoantibody screen, then also the general body radiological screen as well. So all these are done to investigate the cause and to rule out other causes. Then additional tests would include these panel of tests in selected patients, and then these are just general additional investigations, and these are serological investigations in selected patients. So the general tests would include this bone marrow examination, which is basically the bone marrow examination and the urine and the infection screening. And the additional tests, these are basically depending on the type of cause of the autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So in cases of cold hemagglutinin disease, when the age is more than 60 years, so all those when we are suspecting in sort of monoclonal or primary idiopathic autoimmune hemolytic anemia, we want to rule out whether there is underlying malignancy or not. So bone marrow examination would then become an essential part. So in patients who have this primary autoimmune and the age is also elderly, those who are at risk of malignancies, and with features and history suggestive of marrow infiltration, we would go for a bone marrow examination. Then, and in cases of patients who we suspect that they may have thrombocytopenia secondary to DIC or thrombotic microangiopathy, particularly TTP as well. So we could go for a urinary examination and the LFTs and the clotting profile. Then for travelers with infection, with the traveling history, and depending on basically on in children as well, an infection screen, particularly the peripheral T cell subtype. So in children who are presenting early, we do not look at the autoimmune causes, but we'll be looking more into the T cell subtypes to detect immune dysfunction. And then parvovirus infection also in children. If reticulocytopenia is there, then parvovirus and Haematennix can be suspected. And in additional investigation in selected patients with autoimmune hemolytic anemia, so we would do a direct anti-agglutination test. This direct agglutination test is done if that is positive, both if that is positive for C3 and IgG, then cold antibody titer it can be done. Direct agglutination test is mostly done for PCH diagnosis. So in that case, we need to have both cold antibody titer, and since there would be IgG antibodies for PCH, and so we need to do and also the cold and they would act like biphasic, so they're acting mostly at cold temperatures. So this direct agglutination test, and this will go in detail at the end of the guideline as well. So this is done mostly for PCH, and if and we may try, and we need to do a red cell eluate if the DAT is if that is positive for C3 um, if monospecific DAT is, if in case of DAT negative, we would do a red cell eluate, and then again for Donut Landsteiner, these are mostly tests for PCH, this direct agglutination test, and the Donut Landsteiner antibody test. And then the cold, we could also do the cold agglutinin thermal amplitude if there is clinical significance of cold autoimmune